An Eclectic Life, a memoir by Pat Holt. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be used or reproduced in any manner whatsoever without written permission, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical articles or reviews. Copyright 2010, Pat Holt, all rights reserved. Cover design, copyright 2010, Karen Pummel-Neal, all rights reserved. Burr Oak Publishing, printed in USA. Special thanks to the members of WOW for listening, my friends and relatives for reading and rereading my stories, and their encouragement. Thanks also for the encouragement and help with editing of my friends. I have changed the names of some of the people in the following pages to protect their privacy. Others may have different versions of events. This book contains my memories, the way I experienced them. The early days. When I was young, the little white house over the garage up the long crushed stone driveway where I lived with my family was the center of my world. My sister was 15 when I was born. During the early years of my life, when she was in high school, she brought her friends home with her. They used to take me ice skating on the big pond across the driveway from our house. Ice skating was fun while I was skating, being pulled around the ice as a little girl by my sister and her friends, and being the center of attention. The things that I didn't like so much were that my ankles were weak, which meant they bent over as I skated. So they hurt, and I couldn't skate very well or fast. I fell down a lot. Maybe the worst thing in my memory about ice skating was when we went back into the house and my icy feet started to warm up. That's when the pain started. As I think about it now, it is still vivid as it seemed that my toes hurt all the way up to my knees. As I got a little older, I spent a lot of time alone playing in the sand pile that was near the front door of my house. In the comic pages of the newspaper, there were stories about imaginary little people called the teeny weenies. They were real to me, as I made houses for them and roads for them to drive on. I would landscape their houses with little stones and sticks and have hours of fun with them. Sometimes my Aunt Toddy would come to visit my mother and bring my cousin Ronnie with her. We both liked to play in the sandpile. He seemed to me to have better ideas for landscaping his houses and roads. Ronnie and I were almost the same age. I'm only about 2 months younger than he is. As Ronnie and I got older, we were allowed to play farther from the house, which is when we discovered the hayloft in the barn. We had lots of good times making forts with the bales of hay and jumping into piles of it. One day while we were rearranging some hay bales, Ronnie swung the hay hook down onto a bale of hay at the same time I reached my right hand. The curved hay hook dug into my hand between my pinky and ring finger. I'm sure I could see the bone for a while before the blood started. It was a very strange experience, since I don't remember it hurting at all. For a long time I used to look at that scar to be sure which was right and which was left. Now that seems pretty strange. I would think I should have known my left from my right by that age. Somewhere around 11, I think. Ronnie's and my next fun thing to do was to climb one of the pine trees near my house, and to go high enough that the tree would bend toward another tree. Then we would swing to the next tree and have a great time swinging from pine tree to pine tree. It sure was fun, until we got home and got in trouble for all the pine pitch that was on us and our clothes. Sometime in my preteen years, I tied a towel around my neck like a cape and jumped off the greenhouse like Superman would. I didn't fly, just landed unhurt but embarrassed on the ground. The place where I grew up was a wholesale tree nursery, and my father was the foreman. I used to go with him to the greenhouse sometimes and watch as he put little pieces of trees called cuttings into boxes of sand. First, he would dip the cutting into water, then into white powder that helped make the roots grow. And then he would stick them into the sand in straight rows. After these cuttings grew good root systems, they would be transplanted into bigger flats. Then they would be planted out in the fields when they got to be about a foot tall. When these shrubs got big enough, they would be sold to retail stores or smaller wholesale nurseries. The man who owned the nursery was a New York City doctor, so he spent most weekdays away from Pleasant Valley. His wife had red hair, held herself stiffly, and most of the time it seemed to me she carried around a mixed drink. I remember my mother calling it a Tom Collins. Dr. and Mrs. Rawls had 2 children, a boy named Bryant, who was near my age, and a girl named Janet, who was a couple of years older. Their house was the largest house I had ever seen. To add to the size of the house, there was an addition on the end they called the West Wing, which was made up of 6 or 8 bedrooms, with a hallway down the middle. They had a black butler and cook named William to help take care of the house and prepare food for the large parties they occasionally had. Sometimes Bryant and Janet would let me play with them, but mostly I was ignored by them. The driveway in front of our house seemed very long when I was young. I used to have to walk down it all alone to get the school bus. But after I was grown and went back to see it again, it wasn't very long at all. The driveway was covered with crushed stones that were about 1 inch around and had very rough, pointy edges. It seemed to be very important to me that I could run down the driveway barefoot. I always wanted to be like a superhero, and since flying off the greenhouse didn't work, running on crushed stone was the closest I could come to a superpower. Aunt Nettie. My mother's oldest sister was named Henrietta, but everyone always called her Nettie. My Aunt Nettie was really nice and was involved in lots of groups. She was a member of the Women of the Moose, which is a community service organization, the American Legion Auxiliary, and the Eastern Star, which is a part of the Masons. She was the pianist for the Women of the Moose and the Order of the Eastern Star. She used to make corn pancakes for me using real corn that she would cut off the cob. She also used to can bread and butter pickles. Her first husband was my Uncle Herb. They were married and divorced before I was born. They had 1 daughter, my cousin Maudie. Maudie was about 20 years older than me. So it was always hard to think of her as a cousin and not an aunt. Uncle Herb's last name was Wilbur. His family owned a lot of land in Pleasant Valley and had a road named after them. When I was growing up, Uncle Herb and Maudie lived in his family home on Wilbur Road. It was very large and full of antique furniture. As you entered the house, there was a small entryway, It was a place where you could leave your boots and coat so you wouldn't have to bring them into the house. To the right, as you entered, there was a kitchen. In the kitchen, Maudie had a refrigerator that she was buying on an installment plan. She had to put quarters into a device attached to it to keep it running. I don't remember how many or how often. I always remember the whole house as being very crowded with furniture. Whenever anyone in the family died, it seemed that Maudie got their furniture. On the first floor, there was also a dining room, a parlor, a sunroom, and a living room. Upstairs, there were bedrooms and a bathroom. There was a piano in the living room, which Maudie would sometimes play and sing along as she played. She was a gifted singer, and the family lore is that she could have been a famous opera singer if she had tried. But she decided to stay in Pleasant Valley and live in the family home. She fell in love with a married man and devoted her life to him. They had regular dates on Thursday evenings and maybe other times when he could get away. For years, this affair went on, and she always thought that someday he would leave his wife and marry her. I know that because she told me the day he died, when I stopped to see her. She couldn't even go to his funeral, this man whom she loved for so many years without being able to marry. As far as I remember, she never had a job until after his death, and after her father remarried. Actually, her father's marriage is a story on its own. My mother's youngest brother died in 1959, and his widow became friendlier with Uncle Herb. Over time, they started seeing each other romantically. They decided to get married to each other. It was a rather awkward relationship when it had to be explained. She had 6 kids by her first husband, and some of her kids called him Uncle Daddy, since he had always been their uncle, and now he was their stepfather. After that, Maudie had to get a job. She worked at the local grade school in the office, as far as I know, until she retired. Maudie never married and was a little eccentric. She raised chickens, and sometimes in the winter, when it was very cold, she would bring the chickens into the house to keep them warm and safe. After retirement, since she didn't have enough money to afford her family home, she sold it, but had an arrangement where she would remain living in a specially built section of it. As I grew up and married and moved around, I lost touch with her, until a point after she had to move out of her home due to problems with the people she sold it to. She was living in the home of a lady who was renting out rooms to senior citizens. When I visited, she seemed to be very happy there, since she could have her cat with her. Everyone there seemed to be very friendly. About a year before her death in 1999, when she was in a nursing home, my son and I went to visit her again. And even though she was living in one room, she had made friends, and the residents and staff both enjoyed her beautiful voice. I'm really glad that we took the time to make those visits so that we could get reacquainted before her death. Aunt Nettie's second husband was my Uncle Nat. They lived in Poughkeepsie at 13 Amy Terrace until about 1960, when a major highway construction project was undertaken by the city. At that time, they moved to Hyde Park. It was from her that I learned that the roads in the city were referred to as streets, not roads like in the country. It was very important to her, so she corrected me whenever I got it wrong. Sometimes I would go to spend the night at her house. Their house in Poughkeepsie was different in many ways from the houses of anyone else I knew. Starting with the street, which was made of cement, and the sidewalk right in front. There wasn't any lawn. There were stairs up to the porch, which had a stuffed couch called a glider, because it glided back and forth. We didn't have anything like that back in Pleasant Valley. Our roads were either dirt or blacktop, which I think was macadam. The only place I knew of sidewalks was in the center of town along Main Street, and a short way along North Avenue. All of the houses along these streets in Pleasant Valley had at least a small lawn, and sometimes some flowers. They also had a different heating system. There was a large metal gate in the living room floor with a furnace under, and that is where the heat came up that heated the whole house. In the winter, it got very hot and would burn the bottom of your feet if you stepped on it. It was pretty uncomfortable to step on, even in the summer with bare feet. The bathroom was upstairs, and the toilet was another thing that was really different from what I was used to. Instead of a normal tank to hold water right behind the toilet, the tank was up closer to the ceiling, and there was a chain attached that was pulled to flush the toilet. Sometimes when I would come to visit, we would go to the movies at a theater called the Astor Theater. It was only about 2 or 3 blocks away, so we would walk. That theater later was closed and reopened as a restaurant called The Chance that had live music. As an adult, I saw Dr. Hook, Chris Christopherson, and many other famous artists there. It was always fun to go and reminisce about my days as a youngster watching movies when it was a movie theater. Aunt Nettie died in 1962 at the age of 69. Uncle Nat died April 22nd, 1960, on their 21st wedding anniversary, and he was only 66 years old. Uncle George. Fire Island is located along the southern edge of Long Island, New York. It is about 31 miles long and very narrow, and varies from 0.1 miles to 0.25 miles wide, according to the information on the size of Fire Island taken from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia online. The only way onto the island is by the 5-mile ride on the ferry from Sayville, New York. The part of the island where I had been staying does not allow cars because there aren't any roads. The walkways are boardwalks built up over the sandy land. The fire department uses a golf cart-sized fire truck, and the garbage is collected from each house along the boardwalk with the golf cart garbage truck. My friend's home is on the beach side of the island, and her front yard borders the clothing-optional beach. I stood near the dock on the hot summer day as I was leaving from a relaxing weekend with my friends. My thoughts suddenly turned to my Uncle George. I could picture him boarding the train from New York City and getting the ferry at Sayville to come over to Fire Island to spend time with his friends at the beach, sitting in the sun that he loved so much. I am sure he kept his clothes on. Probably he wore his suit pants and his white ribbed undershirt, similar to what he wore when he sat in the sun at our house. He was my mother's oldest brother and had lived in New York City all of his adult life. He was born April 12th, 1896, over his father's store in Pleasant Valley, New York, and grew up in Pleasant Valley. He moved to New York City after he served in the Navy during World War I. Uncle George loved sitting outside in the sun, and when he came to Pleasant Valley to visit my parents, he always sat outside in the lawn chair to sun himself. He had shiny silver hair, which was thin and he always wore it combed straight back and held in place with some hair product of the day. I don't know what he used, but I do know that he smelled good. I think it was Old Spice, because I remember seeing those bottles with his luggage when he came to visit. He was a little taller than my mother, but much thinner. He always dressed very neatly, with suit pants, nice shirts, and jackets. His hands were soft, more like my mother's than rough like my father's. And he buffed his nicely manicured nails. He worked in an office in New York City at the Addressograph Company, where he made metal plates for imprinting names and addresses on mass mailings. It was always a big, happy event when Uncle George was coming to visit. My mother, father, and I would pile into our car, and Daddy would drive us to the train station in Poughkeepsie, New York, to pick him up. Uncle George would get off the train carrying his brown leather suitcase. I would always ask him how long he was going to stay, not because I wanted him to leave, but because I wanted him to stay a long time. He was so kind and gentle. I loved him the best of all my uncles. When we got back home, he would open his suitcase and he would always have a new dollar for me and some chocolate candy from the Schraff's candy store in New York City. We would always stop on the way home from the train station to get some coffee cake for all of us to share. He really liked sweets, so we had plenty when he visited. Most of the times, when he visited, we would go out to dinner at the Smith Brothers restaurant in Poughkeepsie, and I would have Mary's Little Lamb Chop. Now, as I think about that name, I wouldn't want to eat it. Sometimes we would go to a Chinese restaurant that had little cups without handles for tea. I can remember turning the cup around and around looking for the handle. I didn't realize when I was very young, but Uncle George had a wonderful dry sense of humor. Even though Uncle George loved to eat and ate very well, he could only eat small amounts at a time, and he was very thin. He said when it was windy in New York City, he used to have to hang on to light posts. I have a picture of him, and on the back he wrote, "Ultra Bright ad, showing off my new teeth." Also noted on the back of the picture is that he weighed 65 pounds. Ultra Bright is toothpaste marketed by Colgate-Palmolive. Uncle George died at St. Clair's Hospital in New York City. He had gotten knocked down and broke his hip while shopping and never recovered. I will miss his dry wit and positive attitude. Seamstress. While I was married, I did a lot of sewing. I made most of my daughter Karen's clothes, some of my son Tony's, and a lot of my own. And I even made boxers for my husband Frank. Little girls are easy to sew for, and boxers are pretty easy to make. I would make dresses for Karen and matching clothes for myself. When Tony was small, I made him some pants with elastic waistbands. But once he needed zippers, I stopped. I wasn't very good at putting zippers into men's pants, so I didn't make any pants for Frank or Tony. When our neighbor Linda was planning her wedding and didn't have much money, she asked me to make her wedding dress and bridesmaid dresses, so I did. It wasn't really hard. I just went with her to the store and bought the butterick pattern that she chose. She was the same size as the pattern, and the material she chose was easy to work with. The bridesmaids also fit their dresses without problems. Since I was doing so well at all those projects I attempted, I thought it naturally followed that I could do some sewing for people around town and make some extra money for our family. It seemed like a simple plan to me. I just needed to find customers. I knew a local woman in Pleasant Valley who did sewing for money. I asked her if she had any extra customers that needed sewing or alterations. Would she refer them to me? She agreed, and I was ready to get started. The first customer she referred to me was a very nice lady, but her proportions were rather unconventional. Her bust was rather large, so she needed a large size for the front of her dress. Her back was very narrow in contrast to her front. The first obstacle to be overcome would be to alter the pattern to fit. Her hips were even larger than her bust, so the dress had to be enlarged for that area too. To compound the problem, the material that she chose was very expensive and slippery. It was some kind of silk or rayon blend. I don't remember which. Since I had taken on the task, I felt that I must finish it, and I did. The amount of time it took was way more than I had expected when I quoted her the price, and when I agreed to do the job. If you calculate the amount of time I spent and the amount of money I earned, it was probably about 5 cents per hour, or maybe less. I didn't even allow for the stress connected with the project. It certainly was a learning experience in many ways. I learned I wasn't cut out to be a seamstress for hire. I learned that when you ask someone for recommendations, the people they suggest might be the customers they don't want to work with because the project might not be profitable. Although Jane liked her dress very much, my career as a seamstress for hire came to an end. After that short attempt at being a seamstress for money, I gave up the idea and went back to making boxers for my husband and clothes for my daughter. Turkey farm job. About 5 years after my sister's death, in 1947, my brother-in-law married a lady named Mickey, who I have always referred to as my sister-in-law. They lived near us in Pleasant Valley. I visited them a lot. When I was 16, and Mickey, who was an office manager for a local turkey farm, needed office help at the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, she would hire me. The main business of the turkey farm where she worked was to ship frozen or fresh turkeys as gifts to employees of various companies. Some companies were very big, like P. Lorillard, the parent company of Kent Cigarettes, and Lipton, or the smaller companies or individuals. In the beginning, turkeys were raised on the farm in Washington Hollow, New York, about 5 miles east of Pleasant Valley. Local people were hired to kill, clean, and pluck the turkeys. My mother and aunt were among the workers. This was my mother's first and only job outside the home. Their job was finished when all the plucking was done. We started by typing labels as soon as orders started to appear prior to Thanksgiving. As it got closer to Thanksgiving, the shipping room was set up. Each turkey had to be put into a cardboard box and packed with shredded paper. All employees worked packing turkeys. It was cold in the shipping room, and we got plenty of paper cuts, since it was hard to pack the paper around the turkeys with gloves on, because they would get stuck in the packing. The box was then topped off with shredded red or green cellophane. A gift card was placed into the box and a shipping label attached. Then the box would continue rolling down the assembly line to the sorting area, where it would be assigned a shipping area according to the UPS or post office map. The first year, most of the boxes went to New York City and other places within about a 100-mile range. As soon as Thanksgiving was over, we got started on Christmas. The hours were very long. Mickey was dedicated to her job and we would work from very early in the morning until late at night. On weekends and during school vacations, I would spend the night at her house, and we would fall asleep to Johnny Mathis singing Christmas songs. I continued this job every holiday season for 3 years. During the shipping times, when we finished, the owners of the turkey farm would take us to a nice local restaurant for dinner to celebrate. But no one ordered turkey. Marine Corps time. After graduating from Arlington High School in Poughkeepsie, New York, in June 1958, I didn't find any employment I wanted around home. I couldn't afford college, and I didn't want to get married right away. It seemed logical to me that I should join the service. I started out with the idea of joining the Navy because they offered the most opportunity for different fields of training. And also, my father had been in the Navy during World War I. I went to the Navy recruitment office at the post office building in Poughkeepsie. Everything was going fine until I tried to read the eye chart and failed. My eyesight was not correctable to 20/20, so I failed the physical. The Marine Corps recruiter had been eavesdropping. He saw my sadness at being rejected. He quietly called me aside and told me if I would sign up for the Marine Corps, he would help me with the eye chart. He did that by standing behind me and whispering the letters to me. I passed, and I was recruited into the United States Marine Corps. I was scheduled to leave from the train station in Poughkeepsie March 5th, 1959. Change trains at Penn Station in New York City and have a sleeping compartment, all expenses paid to Florence, South Carolina. I didn't know if I was more excited or nervous. I had never been away from home for any length of time. I don't remember much of the trip south. It is all kind of a blur. A Marine Corps bus took us from the train station in Florence to the Marine Corps Training Center at Parris Island, South Carolina. I arrived at the barracks surprised and happy to see that the other women were as young and as scared as I was. I guess I thought they would be much older. The barracks was a one-story brick building. As you entered the center of the building, to the left, the sergeants and the other non-commissioned officers had their sleeping quarters. To the right was our quarters. As you walked down the cement-floored hallway, the door on the right was to the laundry room, with washers, ironing boards, and sinks for hand washing. The dryers weren't the same as modern dryers where hot air comes in and clothes are twirled around. They had tall drawers with metal rods where clothes would be hung, and then the drawer would be slid back into the heated chamber. As you can imagine, our clothes did not come out of there wrinkle-free and soft, so everything had to be ironed. As we ironed each item, we had spray starch and bottles of water to spray on them to help get the wrinkles out. Our uniforms had to be wrinkle-free at inspection time. This was extremely important, since we had to have daily inspections. If one person failed, we would all lose privileges. A little further down the hallway, on the left, was the bathroom and shower area. The toilets were in stalls with doors similar to the ones in public ladies' rooms of today. I'm not sure how many there were, maybe 10, 5 on each direction as you entered the room. The wall straight ahead as you walked into the room was lined with sinks, which were where we brushed our teeth and where the black girls would heat their curling irons. I remember the smell of burning hair seemed to overpower everything else. Farther into the room to the right, there was a shower room area. The floor there was also cement. There were dividers for privacy while showering, but there was also an open area for dressing. This open area doubled as our smoking area. Continuing down the hall, past the laundry room and the bathrooms, was an area called the squad bay. This is where we lived. At the entrance there was a common area with couches, chairs, and coffee tables. This was our living room, or family room. Through this area, to the left and right, were our cubicles. We slept in bunk beds, 2 of us to each cubicle, and each cubicle was separated by tall green lockers and dressers that held our uniforms. Foot lockers for our folded uniforms were under our bunks. As we began our boot camp experience, some of us needed haircuts to comply with the rule in force at the time. The rule was that your hair could touch but not cover your collar. There were beauticians for the white girls, but since we were in South Carolina, and it was 1959, the white beauticians would not work on the black girls. Much to my shock and dismay, the black girls were given a pair of very large scissors and told to cut each other's hair. They obeyed without question. Actually, they didn't seem as offended as I did. I can still remember my shock at the big unwieldy scissors they were given. Each day during boot camp, we would have to get up very early and be ready for inspections of ourselves and our clothes by 6 a.m. Then we would march to the mess hall for breakfast. After breakfast, we would march back to our barracks for inspection. We all had to have clean, pressed clothes and the proper red lipstick, which had to be the same color as the red on the piping of our dress uniforms. There couldn't be any dust or dirt anywhere, even up under the beds or the spaces under the dressers behind the legs. The cement floors were mopped and buffed with an electric buffer. Our beds had to be made in the standard military way, with extra tight sheets and blankets, and specially folded corners. I never remember anyone bouncing a quarter on the beds like in the movies, but they were expected to be stretched tight enough that a quarter could be bounced. If all these conditions were met to our sergeant's satisfaction, the smokers would be allowed a 10-minute smoke break. Our smoking area was in the open area at the front of the shower room. We were allowed to smoke cigarettes up to 4 times a day, usually 10 minutes at a time. We would have a chance to smoke after meals and once in the evening, if we were really lucky. Someone would get a dustpan, and we would go to the shower room with it, and all huddle around and inhale as much smoke as we could in a short time. Cigarettes get very hot when you're taking such quick, long drags, so I used to light 2 cigarettes at the same time and smoke first one and then the other. The dustpan would have to be emptied and put away by the end of the 10 minutes. The area would then be checked to make sure that there were no ashes or butts around, and we would lose our smoking privileges for next time. Smoke time was a privilege, or not smoking was a punishment, however you want to think about it, since everyone had to pass inspection of our clothes and our bunk area in order for us to be able to have smoking time. At the time I smoked, so I had to suffer when others didn't do their jobs. This type of punishment was supposed to instill teamwork, but I saw it as creating animosity toward those who didn't do their jobs. Most of our meals were like that. March to the mess hall, march back, and hope we could get to smoke. It wasn't until the early 1960s that women were equal to men and were allowed to do more jobs. Although we didn't learn to handle rifles or have hand-to-hand combat training, for some reason that I'm not sure of, we did get to experience chlorine and tear gas in the gas chambers and learn how to put on gas masks. After instructions, we were taken to a long building. First, we walked through the gas-filled building with our gas masks on. After that experience, we entered again without masks and put on our masks after the gas was dispersed and continued through the building and out the other end. We saw a movie and were told about nerve gas and the syringes that male Marines carry to counteract it. But we didn't have to go as far as experiencing that. There was a story that I believed to be true of a platoon sergeant who had taken his platoon through the swamps, and several didn't obey his commands. They were lost in the quicksand, so it was drummed into us that we must obey commands, and that as Marines, we were the best at everything. There was also the story of the soldier who slapped a sand flea that was biting him while he was on a Pacific island during World War II. And the noise of that slap gave away his position to the enemy, causing him and his whole platoon to be killed. Therefore, we were never allowed to slap sand fleas. One time we were encouraged to wear makeup for a drill. We soon realized that was to draw the sand fleas to us so we could practice letting them swarm around and bite us without hitting them. To condition us to obey commands, we were made to march. Even though we were not trained for any combat skills, we were still conditioned to obey without thinking. When we weren't marching or doing calisthenics, we were in classes on Marine Corps history. We learned that since the Marine Corps was created on November 10th, 1775, at Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, they always fought with valor and determination. They were tougher than any other fighters. Between the World Wars, the Marine Corps was headed by Commandant John A. Lejeune, and under his leadership, the Corps studied and developed amphibious techniques that were of great use fighting and capturing the Japanese on small islands during World War II. I have forgotten most of the details of the history, but I do remember the pride that was instilled in all of us. Our mission was to replace the men in offices when they were needed in combat. We marched 3 to 4 hours each day. While marching, it is important to strike the ground with your heel for the sound and so that you look sharp. That is why there were a lot of foot problems from pounding our heels on blacktop as we marched. When we were marching on the drill fields, I remember seeing the male Marines. They had it harder than we did. No one ever hit any of us, but there were always some of them with bandages on their heads. One of the things that we were told was that the women in the Marine Corps were called women Marines, to not take the name Marine away from us. Unlike the women in the Navy, who are called waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, or women in the Army, who are called WACs, Women Army Corps. In the beginning of boot camp, there were about 50 of us. Over the period of training, about half were discharged due to physical problems, which were mostly foot-related, or mental problems, which was from stress. The ability to complete the training when so many couldn't added to our pride at completing boot camp and graduating. Everyone who completed basic training went on to General Office Procedure School, which lasted 4 more weeks and was still at Parris Island. This school consisted of classroom training, marching, and more Marine Corps history, in case we didn't have enough pride. During that time, we had more freedom, including freedom to spend time out of our barracks and around the base. We still had to march to and from meals and had daily inspections. We didn't have cars, so we couldn't go far, but I got to go on Liberty off the base 2 times. The first weekend I went to Beaufort, South Carolina, the town closest to the base, with members of my platoon. The other weekend, I went with a group of friends to Savannah, Georgia, about 50 miles away. We drank quite a bit while we were there. The only places we visited were bars. Before I left Parris Island, I returned to Savannah with my platoon to march in a Memorial Day parade. During the time we were together, we became a very united group of women, and also very sure that being a woman Marine meant that we were the best of the best, and we were very proud of that. The few, the proud, the Marines. Semper Fi, always faithful. When it was time to graduate and go home, I was in the group that was going to go by bus. We were taken to the bus station in Beaufort, South Carolina. As we entered the bus station on that hot, late spring day, the black girls among us were told that they could not wait for the bus inside the bus station. It didn't matter that we were United States Marines. When our friends weren't allowed in the bus station, we went outside and waited with them. It was another of the many instances of segregation and bigotry I encountered in the South. Back home in Pleasant Valley, there weren't many black people that I knew of, and the ones that I did know were just like me. and were treated that way. My mother and father were very good friends with a black lady named Georgie. She was a wonderful lady and the first black person I knew. Actually, she was the only one I did know until I went to school. When we went to the neighboring city and I saw black people, I thought they must be her relatives. Therefore, the idea of segregation was strange to me. The bus ride home was uneventful. While I was home, my boyfriend asked me to marry him. I told him no, that I couldn't marry anyone but a Marine. I believed that only someone who had survived Marine Corps boot camp was good enough for me. After a 2-week leave, I was to be stationed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. While I was away at boot camp, my Uncle Fred died and left his wife, my Aunt Toddy, some money. She needed a car, so she bought a canary yellow Ford Fairlane convertible with a black top, a very snazzy car. She had a new car, and I needed a ride to North Carolina. My parents decided we would all make the trip together. My mother, father, Aunt Toddy, nephew Gary, and cousin Brent and I drove the 663 miles from Pleasant Valley, New York to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Gary and Brent were 12 years old at the time. We drove down through New Jersey and took the Delaware Bay Ferry, which was quite an experience. I once again saw discrimination, this time in the form of colored drinking fountains. I still don't understand it, and I was appalled by it. The trip on the ferry was long and rough. It seemed like it was at least an hour. I know there were times when we were in the middle and couldn't see land in any direction. The bridge tunnel system that has now replaced it is 19 miles long, so I guess that's how far our ride was. On the way, we stopped at some cabins to spend the night, and we stopped to eat at picnic areas along the highway. There were just places to pull off with picnic tables and garbage cans, unlike the rest areas of today. They were also not as crowded, nor did they have public restrooms. The barracks at Camp Lejeune were very similar to the ones at Parris Island, with one exception. At the front end of the squad bay near the door was an area set aside for 4 Corps waves. Those were the nurses' aides that were in the Navy. The Marine Corps did not have medical personnel. We were supported by Navy doctors and nurses. I was stationed at Camp Lejeune for the remainder of my 3-year enlistment. Mostly I worked in men's company office, except the time when I had to have mess duty. In the office job, I was the pay and discharge clerk. I gathered information and filled in the discharge papers and got information prepared for when they were discharged from the Marine Corps. One set of forms that had to be filled in was the DD-214. There were 3 copies needed. That was before the day of computers, so carbon paper was used between the pages, and there couldn't be any mistakes in the typing. Mess duty was something that we did at least once a year, or sometimes as a punishment for minor infractions of rules. It consisted of getting up very early and going to the mess hall to help prepare meals and cleaning up after. For each meal, we had to move all the tables and benches out of the mess hall and pour buckets of soapy water onto the cement floor. Then scrub with brushes, rinse, and use squeegees to push the water into the drain hole and replace the tables and benches for the next meal. There were many similar brick barracks throughout the base, and each contained a company of men, and they were grouped in battalions. There were bars called slop chutes throughout the camp, but the only one that allowed enlisted women who were not officers or non-commissioned officers was the one next to our barracks. There was always a line of men on the sidewalk outside the door waiting to be escorted in, since they could only enter when escorted by one of us. In these slop chutes, hard liquor wasn't served, only beer and soda, but lots of it. There was also a jukebox with all the popular music of the time, a bar, a few tables and chairs, and a large dance floor. During most of my first year, I don't think I ever got past the local slop chute, and I don't think I ever bought a drink for myself. After a while, it became the place to go during the week. But on weekends, when we had more time, we would go into Jacksonville, North Carolina. My challenge to myself was to drink in every bar in Jacksonville on one night. My problem was I kept forgetting what happened when I drank, so I don't know if I ever met my challenge. I had another problem with alcohol, and now I think of it as an allergy. As I drank, I would get hives. They would start out as red blotches on my hands, neck, and face, then blend together to cause me to look pretty strange for a while. Then the redness would fade away along with my memory. It never occurred to me not to drink because of this problem, but I wasn't ever shy about talking about it. Sometimes when we went to Jayville, which is what we call Jacksonville, we would get a hotel room and then go to an ABC store, which is where you could buy liquor. We'd buy some vodka and get some orange juice from the grocery store. We would put them in the hotel room. We would then head out into Jayville and hit the bars. One of our favorite night spots was the Band Box. They had a band, and we would all get drunk and request the band to play our favorite song, Boney Maroney, over and over. We especially liked that song because the name of our commanding officer was Captain Maroney. After the bar closed, we would go back to our hotel room and continue drinking. One of the other things I remember doing was going to the beach. We used to go to Onslow Beach, North Carolina, because it was only about 14 miles away. I would join some friends who had a car, since I didn't have a driver's license, and we would stop at an ABC store to get some cases of Carling's Black Label beer. The reason I remember the brand of beer is that I have a picture of myself with a couple friends on the beach with a pile of Carling's Black Label beer cans. I didn't do much swimming, except one time I remember walking out into the ocean. Then the next thing I remember is sitting by the fire drying out. Mostly we would just build a fire and sit around it and drink. In the spring of 1961, I made what was considered an outstanding comment in the If You Ask Me column of the Camp Lejeune Globe, the base newspaper. Whatever it was, it impressed the commanding officer of Company L, Tigers, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, so much that I was invited to receive an award of being named the Tigress of the Month. And I was given a certificate and review of the formal guard mount. What this meant was that I went to their company area and watched as they marched past. When they stopped, I could walk between the rows and inspect as they saluted with their rifles. It was a really great honor. There were some things I didn't like about the Marine Corps. Like every month, even after boot camp, we had to have inspections where everything was checked for cleanliness and all our gear was checked. We needed to maintain at least 2 complete sets of uniforms in perfect condition. To prove that we maintained them properly, we had an inspection referred to as junk on the bunk. For this inspection, all required items of clothing had to be folded and displayed on our bunk in the prescribed manner. That was one of my least favorite things that I had to do. Seemed like such a waste of time. Other unpleasant memories were the times when there was a purge of lesbians. Every once in a while, since homosexuals were not allowed to serve in the Marine Corps, there would be a list of women who the officers in charge determined were lesbians. This list was provided to the commanding officer by informers within our company. We would be called into formation, and the lesbians would be called out and given an other than honorable discharge. This is a category between general discharge, which you get if you separate under honorable conditions, but without sufficiently meritorious military record to deserve an honorable discharge, and a bad conduct discharge, which you only get after a court-martial. There was never any other proof needed or trial, just the word of those informers, and action was taken. I used to go home on weekends sometimes, mostly long weekends, but sometimes regular ones. I would get a ride up to New York City and get the train from Grand Central Station to Poughkeepsie and take a taxi to my home in Pleasant Valley, or sometimes my father would pick me up at the train station. Most of the time I knew the guys that I got rides with, but not always. The base rule was that you could go anywhere on weekend liberty within 600 miles of the base. Most of us didn't follow that rule. On one nice spring weekend, when my Aunt Donna was getting married and I wanted to go, I talked my friends Sam and Sonia into driving the 663 miles to Pleasant Valley, New York, to the wedding. We brought our dress blue uniforms because we were very proud of who we were and wanted my family and friends to see. Sam drove his Pontiac Catalina straight through. I think he did take a nap after we arrived, but it couldn't have been very long. We got dressed in our uniforms and looked really sharp for the wedding. After the wedding, we had a few beers and a few more drinks of whatever was offered. It was mid-afternoon, and we decided that we should go back to my house, which was only about 3 or 4 miles from the wedding, and rest, so we could go out partying some more in the evening. Sam was speeding down the road as Blue Moon was blasting on the radio. As we hit a bump in the road, the car couldn't make the turn, and I heard the weeds and dirt hit the car as we left the road. The next thing I knew, we were upside down with the windshield broken. As I crawled out through the windshield, I was telling Sam to get out. Sonia had been thrown out of the car. We had all been sitting in the front seat and not been wearing seat belts. I don't even think cars had seat belts back then. There was a house across the street, so I went over to ask them to call an ambulance for my friends. I thought I was very calm until I started to knock on the door, and my hand became like it belonged to someone else and banged uncontrollably on the front door. When the lady came to the door, she said her husband was calling the ambulance. It came soon after. We were taken to the local hospital. I had cuts on both my knees. Sam and Sonia both had head injuries and other bumps and bruises. We were supposed to stay overnight in the hospital, but decided that we had to get back to the base on time so we wouldn't get in trouble. My cousin Babs and her husband Nick drove us back to Camp Lejeune. We arrived on time, but we did get caught for being outside the 600-mile limit on weekend liberty because of our stay in the hospital. We were given disciplinary actions called Article 15. That consisted of going in front of the battalion commander and getting some kind of sentence. We all got some restriction to base and a suspended sentence of reduction in rank. The everyone does it defense didn't work. From that I learned a rule is a rule, and if you get caught, it doesn't matter if everybody else does it. As I settled into a routine of the slop shoot during the week and Jayville or Pleasant Valley on weekends, time went by. One night in the line for the slop shoot, there was a very handsome man with dark brown eyes and black hair. His name was Frank, and I let him escort me in. I think it was love at first sight. We started going steady right away, and soon after he asked me to marry him. Of course I said yes. He was a Marine, had been in the Marine Corps for almost 9 years, and was as gung-ho as I was. I brought him home to meet my family, and they hit it off right away. He was certainly a charmer, and had quite a gift of gab. Finding out that he was about to be court-martialed for being a bigamist didn't stop me. I believed his story that he was divorced from Olivia before he married Barbara, and that he truly loved me. His first wife, Olivia, was in Arizona, which is where he had lived when he enlisted. I'm not sure where Barbara was from, or whatever happened to her. He did end up getting a court-martial, and spending time in the brig. Because of the intervention of Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, he was released from the brig and discharged from the Marine Corps with a general discharge. I left the Marine Corps March 1962 and went back to Pleasant Valley. When Frank was discharged, he also came to Pleasant Valley and stayed with my cousin Babs and her husband Nick until July 1963 when we got married. We moved into a nice little cottage and expected to live happily ever after. I had found my Marine. Storm Window Factory. Sometime during 1974, I worked in the window section of a factory in Butler, Missouri, where aluminum storm windows and doors were made. The aluminum sections came in long lengths, so we used very loud saws to cut them to fit desired size windows. My job was called a peener. There was an assembly line with cut sizes on a conveyor belt. It wasn't the kind that moves automatically like the famous Lucy and Ethel candy factory, just rollers to make the pieces move faster. My job was to choose 2 pieces, hold them firmly together at the angled end, and push the foot pedal, which would bring down the automatic ball-peen hammer down to permanently join the 2 pieces. Turn and attach the others until a square or rectangle frame was made. There was a guide on the machine so that the corners were held square, and the hammer struck the aluminum piece in the proper place. Square window forms were easy, but for rectangles, the order of the pieces was very important and must be chosen carefully, or the window parts wouldn't fit together. The pieces had to fit long, short to make a perfect rectangle. We all belonged to a union, and as I remember, it was a chapter of the UAW, United Auto Workers. Because of our union membership, there were strict rules, and bells to tell us when to start work for the day. Bells when it was time for starting and stopping our breaks, for lunch, and for quitting time. We were very well organized in that respect. We had dues automatically removed from our checks each week, along with a $1 donation anytime someone died. We all thought it must be for anyone in the entire union who died, since there were many weeks when $1 was removed and we didn't know of anyone dying. I am not sure of any benefits we got from the union except the bells. When it was time to renew our contract and we wanted a raise, the union representatives met with the management and we did not get a raise. The union seemed to always side with the management. At the time, we were getting paid a little over minimum wage, which at the time was $2 an hour. It was probably due to the union that we got anything over the minimum wage. But at the time, we didn't think they did anything for us, except take dues and extra $1 almost every week. The job was pretty boring, as you might expect. Sometimes, as a change of pace from peening, I worked as a spliner. That job entailed forcing a rubber spline into the groove in the window frame to keep the screen in place. No matter what the job inside the factory, there was always the shrill whine of the saws cutting the aluminum pieces. It never occurred to me that I should wear ear protection, and I'm sure that is the cause for some of my hearing loss. That job was my only experience with a union, so it also caused me to be skeptical of unions. Working at Wassaic. I graduated from LPN school in Nevada, Missouri in 1976. Shortly after, with the help of my ex-husband, I loaded up my Country Squire station wagon and a U-Haul with all of our belongings and brought my 2 kids, Karen and Tony, back to my hometown of Pleasant Valley, New York. I took the exam in New York and got my LPN license. At the time, there were more LPNs than there were jobs for them. I applied at a local hospital where I would have taken a job as a housekeeping department, but I was turned down because I was overqualified. I was able to get a job in a kitchen, working and cleaning at an adult care facility, which for some reason I wasn't overqualified for. While I worked there, I looked for something else where I could make more money. I got a job at the Harlem Valley Psychiatric Center in Dover, New York. In 1975, the Willowbrook Consent Decree was signed. According to Wikipedia, in early 1972, Geraldo Rivera, then an investigative reporter for television station WABC-TV in New York City, conducted a series of investigations at Willowbrook, on the heels of a previous series of articles in the Staten Island Advance and Staten Island Register newspapers, uncovering a host of deplorable conditions, including overcrowding, inadequate sanitary facilities, and physical and sexual abuse of residents by members of the school staff. Rivera later appeared on the nationally televised Dick Cavett Show with a film of patients at the school. In 1975, a Willowbrook Consent Decree was signed. This committed New York State to improve community placement for the now designated Willowbrook class. Because of this, conditions had to be improved at all psychiatric centers in New York State. As part of that, several buildings had to be rebuilt. While that took place, the residents were housed at Wassaic Psychiatric Center, a few miles away. More workers were needed to care for the residents. Because I was an LPN, I was hired for the third shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., as a therapy aide during the week, and I replaced the RN on weekends. I could have had a job in the infirmary as an LPN, but there didn't seem to be any future there. So I chose the therapy aide/RN position. It was my first experience working as a nurse, and my first experience working with that population. During my training, I had worked in a nursing home. While I held that job, there weren't any medical emergencies, a fact for which I am very grateful. I did have to deliver the prescribed medications during my shift, and if any of the residents became out of control, which was referred to as going on the buck, I had to call the duty doctor and get permission to administer a shot, usually Valium. I had to draw it up into the needle and give the shot. Previous to this, the only shots I had given were to oranges, and that was with supervision. It was very scary, but I needed a job, so I did what I had to do. When I wasn't giving prescribed meds, I worked directly with the residents on one of the wards as a therapy aide. The building I worked in contained adult retarded women of different ages and different degrees of retardation. Most of these women had grown up in institutions and were products of a system where the higher functioning women took care of the lower functioning women. They fed them, dressed them, and led them around. I don't think they had separate rooms in the past. They just shared a large open room with rows of single beds. The wards in the building where I worked consisted of a large common room we called the day room. From that, in one direction, a hall with rooms on either side, and the other side opened to the elevator and the area where the food was distributed between the two wings. During the night, our job was just to see that things ran smoothly. and everyone stayed in their beds. We attempted to de-escalate situations by talking first, then gentle restraint. For major problems during the week, we would call the RN. On weekends, I would be called to give a prescribed shot. It could be very dangerous. Some of these women were very strong. I can remember one woman getting very agitated and pulling sinks away from the wall and trying to throw them at us. A lot of the women didn't have verbal skills and had been institutionalized most of their lives. When they threw temper tantrums, things could escalate very quickly. We were able to subdue the woman pulling the sinks, and a shot was given. She calmed down. It was all part of another night at work. In the morning, our job was to get the residents up and teach them to dress themselves. To understand the futility of this, you need to understand that these women were already adults with patterns. Previously, the women who could dress themselves would do so, then dress other women. Many times they had their favorite friends that they wanted to take care of. We came along and upset their way of life, which didn't always go very well. Most of us didn't have any training in teaching retarded adults how to do things. The truth is that not much teaching went on. We had about an hour to see that 25 residents were dressed and ready for breakfast each morning. Since there were 2 or 3 of us, just getting them ready was quite a challenge. The staff was 2 therapy aides on each wing with a floater to go whichever side she was needed on. As an example, there was a resident named Sharon. She liked to dress herself. After she was dressed, she would be sent to join the other residents in the day room. As we got other residents dressed, we would send them into the day room to wait for breakfast. Sometimes we could not spare a worker to supervise those waiting in the day room. Sharon liked to dress herself so much, and she didn't seem to understand that she was only supposed to wear one set of clothes at a time. She would undress other residents and put their clothes on. It wasn't rare to think everyone was ready for breakfast, only to walk back into the day room and find several naked residents sitting or walking around, and Sharon wearing their clothes. We would then have to get Sharon to give up the clothes she had stolen and redress the other residents. One time, as I was attempting to get some of the clothes off of Sharon, she bit me on the shoulder. Since she didn't have any way to communicate except violently, it was a very dangerous situation. Sometimes I was called on to work into the day shift if no one showed up to work. We would take a group of residents for a walk outside, which was a very new experience for some of them. It was quite a challenge to keep them from eating the interesting things they found on the ground. I continued working at this job until spring 1978, when I accepted a position at IBM. The Willowbrook Decree was a very good and important thing, but without proper staffing, it was slow to see results. It did bring sunlight into a very dark and gloomy system and improve the lives of many.